and FM around the UK. It's 5 Live. This morning, I went to speak to a legend in many people's minds, and not in many others. Professor Noam Chomsky has had many lives. While he was still a young man, his groundbreaking theories in linguistics shed new light on the way we speak, think, and even believe. When the Vietnam War came along, he threw himself into the anti-war movement, and he earned his credentials as the tireless social activist he still is. The targets of his criticism have included President Reagan, unrestricted greed, social inequality, Zionism, and of course the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. He champions the Palestinians of Gaza, who live in what he's called the biggest open prison in the world, and with about 150 books to his name, he's still working at the age of 87 in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, otherwise known as MIT. I joined him in his office there on Tuesday morning to discuss the fight against the so-called Islamic State, the chances of a workable deal emerging from the climate conference in Paris, and the diplomatic tension between Turkey and Moscow after that downing of the Russian jet. I asked Professor Chomsky what NATO should do when an ally gets involved in shooting down a Russian fighter for the first time since 1952.
Well, NATO theoretically has a defense system which says if any member is attacked, then all members can respond. But and there have been cases like the kind I mentioned all the way along the line. We can only hope that no great power or even minor power will respond. These things have to be settled diplomatically, or else we're done. There's no room for playing games with military retaliation.
I know that you've expressed concern about the role of Turkey in the Syrian conflict. This doesn't resolve anything, does it? It doesn't make it any clearer.
No, the role of Turkey in the Syrian conflict is quite a different matter. Turkey is supporting the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, the al-Nusra Front, and in fact apparently is supporting it so closely that, well, you may recall a couple of weeks ago the Pentagon sent in its first contingent of Syrian fighters who would have trained 50 people. They were immediately attacked, destroyed, melted away, and so on. It seems to be the case that Turkey informed the al-Nusra Front that they were coming and they were prepared for them. The United States made a deal with Turkey that Turkey would allow the U.S. to use the eastern Turkish military bases to attack ISIS, and Turkey was supposed to do the same. But what they did was attack the Kurdish bases in Iraq, PKK. The PKK is almost indistinguishable from the Syrian YPG. It's their affiliate, and both in Iraq and in Syria, they're the main ground forces fighting ISIS. So we have this. It's not just Turkey. I mean, meanwhile, Saudi Arabia and Qatar are also supporting jihadi groups and may, not the governments, but individuals may still be supporting ISIS, as they've done in the past. This patchwork of, there's almost no one who is not involved in really horrible atrocities. Russia and Iran, of course, are supporting the Assad government, which has a hideous record, but they're the ones fighting ISIS too. It's there's simply no almost imaginable military solution to this conflict. About the only hope, and it's thin, is the kind of negotiations which are finally beginning haltingly in Vienna, which brings together in principle, brings together all forces apart from ISIS to try to see if they can negotiate first kind of small ceasefire regions, which would lower the intensity of the fighting, which is happening and would be very valuable in itself, and then maybe move towards some kind of transitional government, which would sooner or later have elections and some kind of outcome that wouldn't be slaughtering each other. If that doesn't work, Syria is heading to suicide.
Would you support the idea of a safe zone for Syrians in the east, say, or in the west?
A safe zone sounds nice, and if there were a serious safe zone, I think it would make sense. But you have to remember that for Turkey, that safe zone means keeping the Kurds away from the Turkish border. So it's not that simple. When they talk about a safe zone, they're not saying we're real humanitarians, let's save people. They have their own agenda, which is primarily anti-Kurdish. And the Kurds are the one group within Syria that have managed to establish a region under their control, which is where they have pretty much defended themselves and even expanded some into ISIS territory, and apparently have a pretty decent governing system running. So observers have felt, and they do, I think, clearly merit support, but that means dealing with the Kurds in Iraq, who they're closely related to and who are on the U.S. terrorist list. You can't have it both ways. And if you look at the actual fighting, we don't have really good evidence, but the bits and pieces that come through seem to indicate that the PKK, the Kurdish guerrillas based in Iraq, are probably in the forefront of most of the fighting. They seem to be the ones who primarily rescued the Yazidis during that horrible incident. And in Syria, the YPG, their close Syrian affiliate, seems to be the main ground force that's doing anything. So you can't both have them as the ground force attacking ISIS and put them on the terrorist list so you attack them. That's not a policy.
As we look with a distance of about a couple of weeks now at the horrors in Paris, what should our response be as Western friends, as Britain, as America, as France? How should we respond to that?
The first thing to do always is to try to understand the roots and the causes of the attack. If you don't do that, you can't have a sensible response. And there's a good bit of information about it. There has been extensive study of what makes young people from the almost always Muslim community, some others in the West, become part of this monstrosity. Scott Atran, others have investigated it in some detail, and it turns out that it traces back it doesn't have strong Islamic roots. In fact, many of these people are second generation Muslims who have very little tie to the Muslim community. They pick up the radical Islamic ideology, which incidentally traces back to our ally Saudi Arabia in the course of the association, but they join for other reasons. Mainly, it seems, to find some kind of meaning and dignity and hope in their existence as marginalized people with no opportunities and humiliated, degraded. They're not necessarily from the very poorest sector, but there's just these are young men, nothing in their lives. This gives them a cause. Well, if that's the driving force, you have to deal with that. And the way to deal with that has been discussed by, for example, William Polk, one of the leading Middle East scholars, a long record in high-level U.S. National Security Council, planning, Middle East, and so on. What he's pointed out is, look, the main thing, it doesn't sound dramatic, but the main thing you have to do is improve their lives, give them some alternative to the search for dignity, meaning, honor in becoming violent murderers, with the utopian goal of establishing an Islamic utopia. You just have to create that alternative. Now, as for the particular act, the worst response would be military. That's what we've been doing all along. It's playing the game that ISIS is asking us to play and that Al-Qaeda asked us to play, which is attack Muslim communities, and they can use it as a recruitment tool. Virtually every serious analyst points that out. So it may feel good to say, oh, let's bomb them, but that's doing exactly what they want.
That absolutely includes making a dartboard of the Syrian city of Raqqa, then, where ISIS have their base.
When you attack Raqqa, you're attacking civilians. ISIS are not idiots. In fact, they're doing pretty sophisticated planning. So their fighters and bases will be scattered around the city. You're unlikely to hit much. What you can do is destroy the city and the people who live there, and stir up calls for revenge elsewhere and throughout a good part of the world, in fact. Many of the people coming in are the Saudis, Russians, French, coming from all over for their own reasons, and an attack on what they will perceive as an attack on civilians, Muslims, is just feeding ISIS propaganda that the Crusaders are trying to destroy the Muslim populations. We can say, look, that's crazy, but that's exactly the way it'll be perceived. And that's been going on for 15 years now. When the so-called war on terror was declared, actually redeclared, Reagan had declared one, but by Bush in 2001, Al-Qaeda, the center of Islamic terrorism, was confined to a small corner in a tribal area in northwest Afghanistan. Where is it now? All over the world. All over the world. The most terrorist killings last year, according to a UN study that just came out, were by Boko Haram. Where do they come from? They're to a large extent an offshoot of the NATO bombing of Libya, which destroyed the country, turned it back into warring tribes, sent a flood of jihadis into Africa, weapons all over the place, Africa as far as the Levant, opened a corridor which hadn't existed before for African refugees to flow to Europe. That was the effect of the NATO decision to violate their own Security Council resolution, which is what they did, and to become immediately the Air Force of the rebels instead of pursuing the terms of the resolution. So if you have, it's kind of the old cliche about if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But we have a hammer. Our comparative advantage is violence. And if you use that comparative advantage, you're going to have the effects that we've seen for 15 years. It's the same with the drone attacks, the global assassination campaign. They probably generate what we call terrorists faster than they kill suspects. And it's been happening all over. And if we decide to fall into the ISIS trap and respond to these atrocities by bombing them, that's giving them a gift. Same if the Russians decide to attack the ISIS for bombing the Russian plane. It's probably what they want. It'll mean more Russians people from the Caucasus will flood down to join the terrorist groups.
In Paris, in a few days, week or in a bit, there's going to be this huge climate conference. Everybody says the future of the planet rests on this conference. A report in the Wall Street Journal this morning says that agreement at this conference is by no means assured. You've signed a letter saying that the climate target should be more aggressive than merely 2 degrees onto where we are now in terms of global warming. What's the outlook, do you think?
I don't think the outlook is very good. First of all, every time you open the pages of a science magazine, you find some new threat that wasn't known before. So the journal Science of the American Association for Advancement of Science, its last issue was mostly devoted to global warming and the Paris Conference. And one of these studies found that in Greenland there's a huge glacier which it was believed was anchored to the ground so it wouldn't melt very fast. They discovered it's been detached, which means it's going to melt much faster. There's a big piece of Greenland ice. Effects of that, they can't give you numbers, but it's serious. Same issue of the journal reports that Lamar Smith, the head of the House Committee, Congressional Committee on Technology, Atmosphere, and so on, has issued subpoenas to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Board of the government, demanding that they hand over evidence which he can use to try to show that they're exaggerating the effects of climate change. Now, this is a symptom of something extremely significant. It's extremely important that Paris should lead to a strict, binding agreement of a pretty far-reaching sort. If it does, which is not too likely, it's very likely that the congressional Republicans will kill it. Remember that they're led by climate deniers, and their base is very substantially a denial base. So they may kill it. This is not, Andorra. This is the richest and most powerful country in the world. What happens here matters.
This really does lead us into U.S. politics, which for the last year has resembled a kind of carnival sideshow to a lot of people, with very surprising characters actually leading the pack on the Republican side. Is it reasonable to believe that the American electorate is either going to get more serious about its potential leadership, or are they actually making some kind of a statement? Are they sending a message to the establishment of politics?
Well, actually, what's happening now has been happening fairly regularly for some years. Candidates have been rising from the Republican base who are so extreme that they just don't belong in at least Western parliamentary politics. And up until now, the Republican establishment has succeeded in beating them back and getting their own man. So they got Romney last time, even though the base was coming up with Herman Cain and Santorum and others who are indescribable. This year, for the first time, they aren't succeeding. They're trying very hard to get rid of these people, and they can't. The usual methods, pouring money and negative ads and so on, just aren't working. And I think what's happening is, if you look over the longer term, since roughly the 1980s, the Republican Party, both political parties, have moved to the right. So what are now called Democrats are pretty much what used to be called moderate Republicans. Bernie Sanders is called an extremist. He's basically a New Dealer. Eisenhower said that anyone who questions the New Deal doesn't belong in the American political system. Actually, Sanders is about the only one who meets that condition. And the Republicans have went so far to the right that they can't get votes. They're so dedicated. You look at their programs. They're so dedicated to support for the rich and the powerful and crushing everyone else. And that's literally true. They're so that they cannot win votes on their own programs. So what they've been compelled to do is to mobilize sectors of the population that have always been there, but were never, not since, early 19th century, were not organized into a major political force. That's probably a majority or close to a majority of their base now is the ones who vote in primaries are evangelical Christians. Many of whom think the world was created a couple thousand years ago. It's sacrilegious to talk about global warming because you're interfering with God's plans and so on. That's their base. Another part of the base is nativists, a lot of them white supremacists, who are really concerned about the fact that they, are taking our white Anglo-Saxon country away from us. And this is a very serious matter. You probably saw, and others are just plain racist. Try listening to talk radio in Boston, and listen to that's basically the Republican base. Just listen to what people are saying. It's frightening. It's worth doing it. I do it often when I'm driving, and it gives you a picture of a sector of American society, which happens to be not substantially the Republican base or even to the right of it. Well, these things are showing up in all sorts of ways. So you probably noticed a couple of weeks ago the winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics discovered, you saw this.
He's a Scot. Yes.
Oh, is he? Yeah.
Yes.
He found that for the first time in modern history, mortality is increasing among a sector of American society, middle-aged white males, sort of 45 to 55. These are people who have been, who are the victims of the neoliberal policies since the Reagan years, which meant stagnation or decline for much of the population, including the working class. And they're not reacting by, as they did, say, in the 1930s, by organizing the CIO and building unions and supporting New Deal measures. The way they're reacting is by either giving up, like as in this case, becoming alcoholic, suicide and so on, or else turning to the kind of appealing conception that they are stealing everything from us. And they means, Hispanics, blacks, Syrian refugees, or simply the poor. So Reagan's welfare queen propaganda does touch a nerve. People in the sort of next to lowest quintile look down below them and have this picture of rich black women driving in their limousines to pick up welfare checks, scroungers who refuse to work, who are taking away our money and so on. Doesn't matter how crazy it is. These are things that people believe. And they have a certain basis in, like most craziness, they have some basis in reality. And that's becoming the base of the party, this kind of collection of sectors. And it has led to reached a point where the Republican establishment, which is going berserk, cannot get rid of these people.
I have a last question, because you've been very generous with your time, but I ask this with disbelief. I can't believe I'm even asking this, because people like me have always dismissed it out of hand. But could America have a President Trump?
Oh, yeah. It's not at all impossible. He's maintaining his lead in the polls. Frankly, I think it's unlikely. Remember that the primaries are not in New Hampshire's a little different, but most of them are not in the what are called blue states. That's where there are plenty of Republican voters, and I doubt that they'll support a Trump, but you can't be sure. I mean, the mood of the country is kind of frightening in many ways. Not the whole country, but significant parts of it. Furthermore, when the election, if Trump is nominated, or the Carson, say, or maybe Cruz, any of them, which I think any of them in the White House would be really frightening. But if one of them does win the nomination, it's by no means clear that Clinton will win, just presumably the nominee. There's a lot of baggage there that the Republican PR system is just sitting on, gloating, planning to unload as soon as the election begins. Clinton Foundation, all kind of shenanigans. You can read an article in Harper's about it this month, and so on. And who knows what will happen in a country with a mood, where a popular mood is partly substantially like this. The possible killing of an agreement in Paris would be a horrible consequent effect. But there are many other things. So, for example, when they take the Iran nuclear deal, which is welcomed all over the world, this is the only place where opinion is split. But if you look at the Republican primary candidates, first of all, they said virtually all of them, maybe not Kasich, are against it, and very strongly so. So right away there was a debate between, I think it was Bush and Rubio, I forget which two, about whether they would bomb Iran as soon as they were elected, or wait until after the first cabinet meeting. I mean, can you imagine the consequences of that? Not saying they would do it, but they're talking about it. These are the plans. And again, this is not Andorra. This is a country that matters. And you may have noticed that one of the recent Gallup polls of international opinion asked, among other questions, which country is the greatest threat to world peace? And the U.S. won by a huge margin. No other country was even close, way behind. In second place was Pakistan, inflated by the Indian vote. Other countries very low. This was not reported in the United States, but that doesn't mean it's not a fact. And I think you can see reasons for it.
Professor Noam Chomsky, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.